There's a story that I've heard from several of you that I love about how the Baptist General Convention of Texas wanted to purchase a piece of our property some years ago. Moon Tower on San Antonio Street would have extended to 22nd if we'd have accepted their offer, their generous offer. For those of you who may not be up on your state Baptist denominational politics, first of all, consider yourselves blessed. And second of all you need to know is that UBC was a part of this group. We were an important voice in the BGCT for most of the 20th century. We housed the first Baptist student union in the country here in our education building, but the BGCT kicked us out back in the 90s, a fact we wear as a badge of honor, by the way, because of UBC's brave and prophetic stance as an open and affirming congregation before it was cool to be open and affirming, especially in Baptist life. So despite all of our shared history, there was no way in heck we were going to go and be business partners with them, right? No matter how much money they offered. It's interesting to me because at the same time, throughout UBC's history, we've partnered in other ways with Catholics and Jews and Muslims and churches in East Austin who likely had similar differences with us than the BGCT did, or even bigger differences. But the Baptist General Convention of Texas was different because it was like a sibling rivalry, like being estranged from your family. The closer you are, the deeper those divisions cut. You know what I'm talking about. And I think that's what's happening here in our text from Mark 7 when Jesus flips his lid on the Pharisees. Now, the picture that you may have in your head of the stereotypical Pharisee, legalistic, goody two-shoes, self-righteous hypocrite, isn't really a fair picture. It's the image that we get from reading the Gospels, which are in large part an account of this intense sibling rivalry. The truth is that the Pharisees were the Jewish sect that probably had the most in common with Jesus and his disciples. Their movement was doing something similar to what the Jesus movement was doing, trying to bring religion down to the common folks. The priests at the temple had special rituals for washing their own bodies and their instruments of worship. So the Pharisees took these high and mighty rituals and adapted them for regular, non-priestly people. Washing hands and washing pots in this passage is not about them being germaphobes, although I could have gone a different direction with this sermon, of course. But it's a practice making the claim that everything is holy. We don't just wash in the temple, we don't just wash holy relics or priestly hands, we wash our worker hands. We wash our common food, our peasant tools, because God's gift of holiness is for everyone, not just the priests in the temple. This was the intention of the hand and pot washing of the Pharisees. It's a good and beautiful intention. These are devout people who did something new and fresh and risky. So what goes wrong? Why does Jesus go off on them like an angry teenager, poop joke and all? I don't know if y'all caught that. Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not into the heart but the stomach and goes out into the sewer? Jesus quotes Isaiah, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition." All movements, no matter how spirit-inspired and worthy they are eventually faced with the temptation of becoming just like those they broke away from, right? The Pharisees' traditions of hand washing were meant to democratize the commandment of God, to make God more accessible. But now what was meant to connect people to God has become just another way to separate, just another way to judge them. Why do some of your disciples eat with dirty hands? What a terrible example. What a disgrace to the holiness of God. Surely you can't allow that, Jesus. Do you see how easy it is for that to get twisted? I think we should hear this as a cautionary tale, beloveds. Whatever brave history we may have, whatever spirit-inspired movements have made us who we are, we have to constantly be on guard against turning into the very thing we broke away from. We have to constantly evaluate our life as a church, asking, is this the will of God or is this human tradition? How do we tell the difference? Jesus gives an example about how the Pharisees are giving away all that they have to God. Sounds good, right? But it's to the point that there's nothing left for them to take care of their own aging parents with. God's command is that children honor parents, and in a time where there was no Medicaid or Social Security, it was especially important for adult children to care for their parents. It was a part of their duty. The good practice of giving to God became a hindrance to their ability to actually keep God's command in this case. How are our traditions preventing us from doing what God actually cares about? In Matthew 23, Jesus gives another example. He notices how the Pharisees give away a portion of everything that they have, even the spices in their gardens. But Jesus says they neglect the weightier matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faith. You strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel, he says. Have our traditions become substitutes for or distractions from what God really cares about? With the hand washing in our text today, the thing that was meant to bring people closer to God has become another criteria for exclusion from God. What parts of our practices, our tradition, are having a different effect than what we intended initially? Confronting these questions again and again is a crucial part of our work as a church and of our growth and sanctification as Christians. We have to constantly work at sifting out the will of God from our human tradition, because no matter how well-intentioned our religious practices are, they can so easily be twisted without us even realizing it. We're not immune. In some churches, you might think that Robert's Rules of Order were written on stone tablets and sent down the mountain with Moses. And we have to ask, is the way we do business promoting justice, mercy, and faith? Some of you have had the practice of tithing 10% of your income pressed down so deeply into your bones that you've written that check to the church even when you weren't able to pay your utility bills. Or you felt a sense of guilt and shame when you haven't been able to do that. It's difficult to give joyfully and from abundance when you're struggling to make ends meet. Is that God's will or human tradition? We're going to talk more about giving and tithing later this fall, but spoiler alert, tithing is a well-intentioned tradition that can easily become oppressive and unjust. Some of you should be giving much less than 10% of your income, and some of you much more. What about our other spiritual practices? When I was growing up in the 90s as an evangelical kid, there was a big push for having your quiet time every morning. If you were a good Christian, you did this thing. And I'm sure that that practice of connecting with God intentionally through scripture and prayer and quiet works beautifully for lots of people. But for others, particularly those of you who are neurodiverse, the requirement to sit and read and focus was just another way that you got to feel like a failure. You're not a failure, by the way. The will of God is much more expansive than any of our religious practices, even the good ones. None of these things are bad. Particular ways of doing business, giving to God's work in the world, practicing spiritual disciplines, these are all good things. But when they become the end in themselves, we've missed the point. So what is the point? Jesus says it's what comes out of us that betrays the truth about what's within. In other words, as one of my college professors like to say, you spill out what you're full of. Jesus cares about our insides, our hearts, our thoughts, our feelings. I know many progressive churches like ours tend to focus only on social activism and systemic change, and those are so good and so important, and they can also distract us from looking inward at our own hearts, at our own church practices. We've got to do both, y'all. In fact, transformed hearts and minds are prerequisites for lasting social change, for justice work in our world. So today, Jesus invites us to look inward, for it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come from. The list that we like to usually skip over talks about taking what's not ours, exerting power over others, about violence and greed, dishonesty, lack of self-control, envy. The actual Greek talks about the evil eye. That's not in your English translations, but it's very clear. It means looking at people and wishing bad for them, wishing ill. Slander, arrogance, recklessness, selfishness. There's something for all of us here. We can all find ourselves in this list. We know the state of our heart by what comes out of it. So we're invited to look inward and see, where do I find sin in me? Where am I in this list today? Much of the world around us is pushing us into human traditions of war and vengeance with a religious fervor, especially this last week. Just a few days ago, President Biden compared the U.S. military to the prophet Isaiah, answering God's call, "Whom shall I send? Here I am, send me." And in the same speech, promised to hunt them down and make them pay. Is war and vengeance the will of God, or is it human tradition, dressed up to look like a moral imperative? We know the truth by what comes out of it. Death, greed, hatred. Our religious practices here should pull us out of those things, and we need to continually test them by this criteria. What is this producing in and from us? What is spilling out of our lives? Am I overflowing with love of my neighbor or disdain? Am I overflowing with love for God or pretension and privilege? Am I being truthful, open-hearted, humble, loving? If our practices lead us to violence, envy, shame, arrogance, then we've got to let them go, no matter how well-intentioned they were in the first place. We cannot rely on good intentions from our past. We've got to look at what our lives are producing now. What's spilling out of your life right now, beloved? What's spilling out of the life of our church? These are hard days. It's easy for us to look at ourselves and find out. What's holding us back from doing what God really cares about? What is distracting us from God's command in our community now? What beliefs and traditions are feeding into the sinfulness of our own hearts? The cycle from radical spirit-led movement to tradition-focused institution is one that we, just like the Pharisees, have to constantly be aware of, re-evaluating, on guard against. How do our traditions line up or not line up with the command of God now? How do our practices either reinforce or pull us out of sin's grip? We are known, you are known, as a courageous congregation in our community. May we be brave enough to look inward as well. Amen.